Hi, everyone. Great to have you here. So, in this episode, we focus on Kwentong Isla, or stories of islands. Our guests will discuss how climate impacts coastal communities and marine habitats, as well as communities beyond the shores. I am your host, Kato Sarmiento, Communications Manager at the OML Center. Joining our conversation are Dr. Laurice Jamero, Head of the Resilience Collaboratory of the Manila Observatory, Salikhain Kolektib, represented by Juan Miguel Torres, is a group of communicators that produce 10 animated episodes co-created with community partners to include awareness of small island communities and climate change conversations. Candeze Mongaya, Policy and Government Engagement Manager of Rare Philippines. Welcome. Doc Lau, perhaps you can start off this conversation. Why is it important to look into and discuss the impact of climate change on our oceans? What does the ocean-climate connection mean to Filipinos?
I think by now everyone is already aware that we are in the middle of a climate emergency, but let me walk you through why that is the case again. So right now we are already at 1.1 degrees warming level compared to pre-industrial levels. And unfortunately, all of that warming can be fully explained by human influence on the climate. Now, looking into the future, actually in the next 20 years, we are expected to reach or exceed 1.5 degrees warming level across all 5 emission scenarios that we are looking at. This is terrible news for us here in Southeast Asia, especially for communities located along coastlines and in small islands, because climate impact drivers along the coast, such as coastal flood and erosion, ocean acidity, marine heat wave, and relative sea level are all projected to increase with high confidence in the future. So by increase, what we are saying is that they are going to increase both in magnitude and also frequency. Aside from that, as we hit higher warming levels, we are also going to cross different tipping points. And in fact, one of the first tipping points that we might cross in the future is the die-off of our low-latitude coral reefs. So at 1.5 degrees, we are going to lose majority of our reefs. But once we hit 2 degrees, then we are going to lose virtually all. I'm not sure if you're aware, but we actually have a double barrier reef here in the Philippines. So it's called the Nahon Bank, and it's located in the northern part of Bohol, and it's pretty rare. There's only 6 double barrier reefs in the world, and we have one of them here. And this is just an aerial shot of what a small island in the Nahon Reef, in the Nahon Bank looks like. So in these islands, earlier we discussed about climate impacts. Unfortunately, these climate impacts are not future possibilities for them, but they are already suffering from what are called losses and damages from climate change. So the Paris Agreement actually defines loss and damage as the adverse effects of climate change, including from extreme weather events and slow onset events. And in the case of the small islands in the Nahon Bank, they have already experienced both extreme and slow onset events. So back in December 2021, we were directly hit by Super Typhoon Rai here in Bohol. And it really caught us off guard because it rapidly intensified from category 1 to 5 in 24 hours, leaving us very short time to prepare and even evacuate. By the time we received the warning, it was too late, and it was very difficult to cross from the island to the mainland. Ultimately, Bohol was 6th in line. That was hit by Super Typhoon Rai. It arrived here at around 7:30, and it coincided with our peak tide at 9:30, which added another 1.3 meters of water. And so in the small islands in the Nahon Bank, you actually see a lot of damage. And this is mainly because of storm surges reaching up to 4-meter high. So that's for extreme event. And as for slow onset events, these islands have actually already started to experience tidal flooding. So which means that they are flooded every spring tide, every new moon and full moon of each month. And the islands are completely flooded, and it can last for several hours across several days, depending on the tide level. So of course, it affects the communities in multiple ways. These are just some photos of schools, and school children have to keep going to their class despite tidal flooding. And it can be very dangerous for them to do that because the roads are also flooded. Of course, this has led the community to do adaptation work. So they are considering retreat options, but mostly they are doing in situ adaptation, especially elevating their roads and the floors in their homes, and also doing more on ecosystem-based adaptation, conserving their mangroves and also their reefs. Unfortunately, though, the latest climate report by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says that even with good adaptation, it's still not enough to prevent loss and damage. Loss and damage can still happen. And this is precisely what we have experienced here in the Philippines. So the Global Climate Risk Index ranks the Philippines as 4th most affected by climate change in the past 2 decades. So again, this is not a future scenario. This is something that we have already experienced. And we are ranked number 4 based on criteria pertaining to fatalities and loss in terms of GDP. So with this, next week, myself and the Manila Observatory team are actually flying into Egypt to attend the next UN Climate Change Conference. And there we are really focusing our efforts on calling for the establishment of a loss and damage financing facility. This is a core issue for us in the Philippines, for developing countries. And in fact, small island developing states like Vanuatu are really leading this too. Because right now, even though we are already experiencing losses and damages, we don't really have access to finance to address that. Yes, we receive recovery donations, but that's unpredictable and unreliable and ultimately not enough. So this is something that is a core issue for us and for our small islands. So with that, I hope that answers the question, Kato, and also wish us the very best. And in Egypt, this is going to be very political, I think.
Thank you, Doc Lau. May babalikan lang ako dun sa presentation mo. You mentioned one of the things that are popular in terms of discussions now are tipping points and thresholds. You mentioned that a majority of our reefs will be gone at 1.5 degrees centigrade increase. But tama ba na currently at the current level that we have at 1.1 degrees centigrade, our corals are already getting impacted?
Yeah, I think so. Especially in Australia, the Great Barrier Reef, they do regular monitoring there. And if I am not mistaken, in the past 20 years alone, they recorded 4 mass bleaching events. And it affected majority of the reefs there. So yes, even today at 1.1 degrees Celsius, we are already seeing na the coral reefs are being affected.
I have one more follow-up question. Yes, we can see clearly, especially at times of disasters, photos of devastation in coastal communities. But why should people who are not in the coasts, who are probably in upland and inland communities, care about what happens in the coast? Does it also impact upland and inland communities?
Actually, for hazards like climate-related hazards, it affects different communities differently. So I remember there was a super typhoon in the north 1 or 2 years ago, and in one island it caused storm surge, and then it hit Albay and it caused lahar flow, and then it hit a different place and it caused landslides, and so we are actually facing the same hazards, but then because of our different environments, we experience impacts differently. But having said that, yung adaptive capacity natin is something that we can share with each other, especially in how we take care of our ecosystem-based solutions. I think for island communities and also rural communities, they have a very intimate relationship with their environment. So I feel like this is something that they can share, especially that both oceans and forests serve as sinks for carbon emissions. So the relationship might not be direct, but certainly there's a lot of things that the communities can learn from each other. And hopefully by engaging with each other, we can also minimize trade-offs. Kasi nga, for example, Odette affected 9 different places. And so with the limited funding, we have to essentially compete for a very small pot of money. But if, for example, we have good relationship between, ridge to reef, then maybe we can think of how to best use the little money that we have in order to spread it, equitably across different communities at lahat naman can benefit. And yeah, it will be beneficial for not just for coastal communities, but also upland communities.
Thank you. Plus, ang presyo ng galunggong pati ang availability ng salt is common to all regardless of where you live. Okay. Thank you, Doc Lau. For now, we turn to our storyteller and advocate. Can you please introduce yourselves and the work that you are doing at the intersection of climate change and coastal communities?
I'm part of the Salikhain Kolektib. So it is a research and art collective that focuses more on community-based art projects and also research projects. So for our campaign, we focused on an animated series, a 10-part animated series entitled Sangapulo. So it follows the story of a young girl living in a small island, and she writes on her diaries some stories tungkol sa kanyang isla, the changes that are happening, and siguro wondering din kung ano yung mga causes ng changes na yon. So it will take viewers to understand yung mga realities na nangyayari sa isang small island community, and sa every end ng aming video merong explainer, no? So medyo scientific based. So yung nangyayari sa komunidad na kung paano nila na-feel ay na-explain siya ng science na related sa effect nga rin ng climate change.
Thank you, Boyet. Candece.
Magandang hapon po sa lahat. Ako po si Candeze Mongaya sa RARE Philippines. Kami po sa RARE, we're a behavior change organization that work in marine conservation. Our team works with the national and regional government agencies and LGUs para po maka-encourage tayo ng sustainable fishing behaviors, ma-empower natin yung coastal communities, and ma-prioritize yung community-based management of our fisheries resources and scale this into policy and practice po. Kami po sa RARE, since 2010, we worked with 75 coastal LGUs in implementing po yung tinatawag nating Fish Forever program, Sustainable Coastal Fisheries Program. So in the Philippines po, Fish Forever works with fishing villages and municipal governments to build and strengthen yung ating community-based coastal fisheries management sa ating pong municipal waters. I'm so happy to be here po and hear the stories from our mga kasama.
Thank you. Welcome again, Doc Lau, Boyet, and Candece. Boyet, balikan kita. I understand that within Salikhain Kolektib, you are the on-the-ground community person. Can you tell us more about the stories you referenced for Sangapulo? Were you inspired by a particular community?
Yeah, see. Yeah, that's correct. No? So I forgot to mention the composition of our collective kasi. We have artists, no? Photographers, researchers, community workers, and meron din mga educators. So ako, yung specialization ko, yung art side ko ay photography. And then I also go into disaster studies and disaster research. No? So yung highlight namin dun sa aming campaign, yung island na yun, ay isla ng Suluan. Suluan ay first area na tinamaan ng Typhoon Yolanda 2013. So ito ay nasa Giwan, Eastern Samar. And I was based there 3 months after Yolanda. I worked with a humanitarian organization as their communications officer. So nag-document, kumuha ng mga stories from communities. And I guess yun yung nakapag-inspire din sa akin and sa team namin kung na mag-focus tayo dito sa island na to. No? Ito yung first landfall ni Yolanda. And sa experience ko doon, talagang ang ganda ng lugar, tas ang babait ng mga tao, magaling yung maganda yung community. And very interesting yung story kasi being the first place na tamaan ng ganong kalakas na bagyo, ano yung mga ginawa ninyo, ano yung mga kwento ninyo, kasi zero casualty yung lugar. So very interesting din to find out more about pamumuhay nila doon. So again, doon na pumasok na rin yung kung ano yung mga changes na na-experience nila, epekto ng climate change, kung familiar ba sila doon. And it seems na partnering with them, listening to their stories, very na-experience talaga nila based sa kanilang storya na may pagbabago. Pero ang problema lang, hindi nila ma-explain pa masyado kung bakit. Parang yun yung magandang pinapahiwatig din namin dun sa aming campaign na okay, ito yung storya ng mga tao sa isla. Na-experience nila climate change pero para sa kanila parang ba't ito nangyari? Ano yung mga pwede namin gawin? Ano yung explanation kung ba't nangyari ito? Ito yung gusto namin i-communicate. No? Yung science part ng climate change at yung actual on-the-ground experiences and stories ng mga communities, community members na nakita.
Thanks, Boyet. You're, I don't want to say rare breed, but I hope there are more like you. Na you're a communicator, but you're also a disaster risk researcher. So you focused, at least for the Sangapulo campaign, you focused on Suluan Island, but you're in Marinduque now, and I'm sure you have experience with a lot of other communities facing similar hazards. Do you have, can you share with us some of your insights regarding ano yung nakikita mong commonality sa impact on island communities ng climate change?
So, another reason kung bakit Suluan yung napili, kasi I'm doing my thesis sa area na yon. And yung Suluan and another island sa may Humanon, which is also part of Giwan. So they're both small island communities, and my study is about documenting their natural resource management practices in relation to how they use their environment to reduce disaster risk. So yung approach na ginamit ko doon ay participatory photography. So again, arts-based pa rin siya. No? So we gave communities cameras, dinocument nila yung kung paano nila ginagamit yung kanilang natural resources, kung paano nila ginagamit to prevent, to reduce the risk of disasters, tuwing may typhoon, saan sila nag-evacuate, ano yung mga herbal medicine na nakukuha nila sa island. So I guess yung commonality na nakita ko sa pag-explore ng dalawang islands na yun and yung iba, na yes, nangyayari yung climate change na-experience nila yon. Pero magandang i-highlight na itong mga vulnerable, kahit sabihin natin vulnerable sila sa vulnerable communities na ito, ay meron ding mga matataas na kapasidad to adapt. Kasi very rich ang resources ng small islands. Yun yung kagandahan nun. No? So when they sustainably practice, yung practices nila ay sustainable sa kanilang natural environment, in a way, mas madali silang nakaka-adapt dito sa epekto nga ng climate change. Yet, Pero sa kabilang banda, yun nga, no? So yung isa rin sa effect ng climate change ay yung pag-dwindle ng kanilang resources. So yun, may ganun siya, no? May capacity sila, kaya nilang i-handle based sa kanilang kung ano yung meron sila ngayon. Pero dahil nga, kung mas tumitindi yung epekto ng climate change, they can only do so much, no? Dun sa kanilang kapasidad na meron ngayon. So very important talaga na ma-document yung kanilang kayang gawin at yung epekto ng climate change at hanapin yung kung paano mas kakapacitate pa sila or paano natin i-reduce yung epekto ng climate change para at least hindi sila masyadong apektado. So yun yung nakita ko pong commonality mo na meron sa mga small island communities natin. With regards to sa effect, very similar at yun yung highlight din namin sa aming campaign yun sa mga aming mga stories. Andito yung mga ang laging naririnig, dati yung baybay, nandun yun sa malayo. Ngayon, ay yung dagat nandun sa malayo, nandito na sa atin. Yun, yung mga usual na stories na naririnig. Yung tubig namin dati sa balon, naiinom, ngayon maalat na. So yun, sa kanila parang normal experience pero yun na yun eh. Yun na yung epekto talaga ng climate change. Saltwater intrusion, coastal erosion. Yun yung highlight din po namin sa campaign na ginawa.
Salamat, Boyet. Actually, if you haven't seen the campaign that they did, one of the highlights, I think, is in telling the story of this girl. They actually highlighted the everyday decisions that people in small island communities have to make. Even the possibility of magluluwas ba ako to the city or do I stay here? I turn to Doc Lau and Candeze. What are your thoughts regarding the stories that Boyet shared? Do they sound familiar or similar to the stories in the communities that you've covered?
Yeah, I was actually nodding a lot nung nagkikwento si Boyet kasi sobrang relate kami with our islands here in Bohol. And I really appreciate what you said na, they already experience climate change, but they don't necessarily have the concept of climate change. And this is something that we have to communicate to them kasi it really helps them with planning as well. So, for example, I've been doing my best to tell them about projections for tropical cyclones, that they will be stronger in the future, sea level rise projections, also that they can plan for the future. Kasi right now, it's more of firefighting, so there's flood, so we react to it. But with the concept of climate change and the future view, then they can also act accordingly. And then another thing that I related to a lot was the fact na yes, they're doing something, but climate change is also affecting their capacity to adapt. So this is especially true for ecosystem-based adaptation. So actually, ecosystem-based adaptation is one of the go-to strategies for small islands. But then at 1.5 degrees, a lot of ecosystem-based solutions will essentially lose their effectiveness because they themselves are vulnerable to climate change. For example, yung coral reef. So there's a really strong push for us to reduce or limit global warming, and at the same time talagang i-protect yung environment natin because that's essentially all we have, especially for subsistence level communities.
Oo nga, Doc Lau, and Katono, and nakaka-relate din ako coming from Leyte na daanan din ng bagyo at na-experience din yung Yolanda nung tumama sa Leyte nung a few years ago. And napakaganda talaga na na nalalabas yung nila Boyet yung kwento ng ating mga coastal communities, especially sa small island communities, kasi itong mga itong mga municipal fishers natin ay talagang at the forefront na naapektuhan ng effect ng climate change. But at the same time, ang laki ng role nila for our food security. Like sa pandemic, isa sila sa mga main sources natin ng pagkain. At the same time, nakaka-survive pa rin sila despite the many typhoons na dumaan sa kanila during the pandemic. At naalala ko nga nung mga around 2020, early 2020 na may malakas na bagyong tumama in one of our PO partners somewhere in Bicol, and nag-uusap kami kung paano yung tulong, at ang kinikwento nila tatay doon sa community ay sige, instead na bigyan nyo kami ng yero, pwede bang yung tarp lang ibigay namin? Kasi at least yon, alam namin na pagpapunta na yung bagyo, tatanggalin lang namin yung roof namin, ipo-fold namin, dadalhin namin sa aming evacuation center. Tapos, pag dumaan na yung bagyo, meron ulit kami bubong ng bahay. So these are the stories mo na makikita natin na yung ating mga nangingisda ay parang sa tingin nila parang naka-adapt na sila kung paano sila babangon after dumaan yung bagyo. And this is something na should be documented and should be highlighted. At sa tingin ko, we should learn from in terms, especially sa usapin ng paano makakatulong sa ating mga vulnerable communities, especially sa level siguro ng government agencies in terms of issuing policies kung paano pa masusuportahan yung ating mga municipal fishers, yung ating mga small island communities. And marami rin tayong bright spots kung paano yung ating mga coastal communities bumabangon pagkatapos ng bagyo. Naalala ko yung insight din ng shinare ng isa naming kasama sa Siargao. Meron kasi tayo sa RARE na kasama sa programa natin, yung Fish Forever na program, and part of what we hope to do is really capacitate yung ating mga fisher families na maging financially resilient sila, so matuto silang mag-save, napapaikot nila within their organization yung kanilang savings para parang saving or preparing for the future. And ang kwento nga ng isa kong kasama doon sa Siargao ay nung tumama yung Typhoon Odette is nakikita natin na sira yung lahat ng bahay, pero yung mga kasama na members ng savings club sa community na yon, may na shares, may na prepare sila for the future. So within the week na tumama yung Typhoon Odette, nakabili agad sila ng bubong para sa bahay nila. No, itong mga maliliit na bagay na most people take for granted, no, these are parang very important elements na sa kwento ng pagbangon, especially sa ating mga municipal fishers sa coastal communities.
Salamat, Candice. I'm sure with 75 LGUs, alam na alam ninyo yung mga stories na to and the commonalities. Your comments actually bring to mind, nabanggit ni Doc Lau, yung ecosystems-based adaptation. Usong-uso siyang discussion globally. But when we talk about Filipino resilience, we don't really highlight how small communities and indigenous peoples actually are already doing ecosystems-based adaptation and have been doing it for generations. So food security discussion, normally fisheries are not as highlighted compared to agriculture. Even loss and damage reports, usually ang focus ay on agriculture and infrastructure, not fisheries. So babalik ko sa inyo, Candice and Doc Lau. Are surfacing stories of community action and best practices important and relevant to your advocacies and work?
To me, definitely. Actually, na-offend talaga ako pag sinasabihan ng island communities as sinking, disappearing, hopeless. Kasi in reality, that's very, very far from the truth. Kasi and this also touches back on what Boyet shared, na very resilient talaga ang small islands natin. With the issue of climate change, it's being presented to us as if it's the biggest and only problem of our island communities, and we completely forget their history, where they have been living in such a precarious environment for their entire life, but somehow they are still able to thrive. So definitely there's resilience there. They have done it before, and I'm sure that they can do it again now for climate change. For ecosystem-based adaptation, usong-uso siya kasi this decade was declared by UN as the decade on ecosystem restoration. And yeah, I definitely agree na we need to put a spotlight on the role of the communities in conserving the environment. Kasi there's a lot of development aggression. So, in fact, may usap-usapan na may reclamation program daw dito sa Tagbilaran that might damage 200 hectares. So, diba, considering all that we are already facing and considering the risks already to our coral reefs, bakit pa natin dadagdagan? So there's resilience in the face of climate change. Development is certainly a big issue also. And I think it helps na, especially in the context of small islands, we always think of climate change in relation to development issues.
Candeze?
Yes, tama ka Katono, napaka matunog ng EBA, and these practices talaga napaka-importante na ipalitaw siya as stories and ipaabot siya sa decision makers para mas maintindihan ng karamihan na marami ng initiatives na ginagawa related to EBA. For example, many of our coastal LGUs have the capacity na to manage yung kanilang municipal waters, like designated which areas should be allowed for fishing, which areas dapat protect for mangrove restoration and coral reef conservation. And these are among the EBA practices na ginagawa na natin. And maganda and great reminder yung sinabi ni Doc Lau na at the core of the EBA practice, kailangan nandun sa gitna talaga yung community empowerment na parati nating naririnig, kinukonsulta at take into consideration sa mga management efforts yung kapakanan ng ating coastal communities. Kasi at the end of the day, sila talaga yung pinaka nakakaalam at sila yung una na maapektuhan sa anumang epekto, natural hazards brought about by climate change.
Thanks, Candeze. Interesado ako dun sa term na ginamit ni Doc Lau, development aggression. And I think I will have a follow-up question for Candeze in relation to that. Considering that we are a country of over 7,000 islands, it seems to me like most of our policies are driven without consideration of these islands and that we're surrounded by water. Why is it, do you think, that we're so out of touch with what happens under the sea when we're surrounded by it?
Napaka-importante na ipaabot yung learnings natin sa communities to our decision makers, like sa national or sa regional level, para ma-translate siya into policies and practice that would be beneficial to increase po yung capacity ng ating small islands and ng ating coastal communities and ating municipal fisheries.
How can we communicate to the general public or even our government partners the importance of environmental conservation versus infrastructure development? I think all three of you have some experience with this. How do you go about this?
From what I've been reading, parang hindi na siya green versus gray. There's actually a hybrid approach already where you can have green. Yung first line of defense is really the green infrastructure. So in the case of coastlines, you have your reefs, you have your mangroves, you have your beach. All of these ecosystems can attenuate wave energy. And then, yung gray infrastructure is more to support that. For example, building floodgates and trying to accommodate flooding within the coastal area. So yeah, I feel like there are ways to combine both. What we have to keep in mind though is we really have to value our environment more. I think when talking about ecosystems, it's really hard to put a number to it. Kaya when you weigh the cost benefit analysis, parang lugi kasi wala siyang dollar value, mahirap siyang lagyan ng dollar value. It's very easy to cut off itong mangrove forest to make room for a resort, another resort, na magiging maputik lang naman because it's a muddy area. For me, the decision makers really have to put value in the environment, maybe not monetary value, but really appreciate how yung mga ecosystem services and how it's helping out the communities in terms of protecting them from disasters, giving them food, how their cultures are tied to the environment. All of that needs to be factored in when making decisions to alter or do anything that will affect the environment.
Before I go back to Boyet, Candeze, you've worked with 75 LGUs. RARE has worked with 75 LGUs. So I'm sure you're very experienced with communicating with local government and the general public. What works in terms of successfully communicating to them in terms of weighing development against conservation?
In the LGU level po talaga, one of the parang first thing that we do is really instill like a sense of ownership or pride sa resources that they have in the community, especially po sa ating decision makers like the mayors, yung ating mga municipal agriculture office, yung ating mga municipal fisheries council who are part of the managing, who are also active in managing yung mga resources, no? Kasi ano po maganda pag may sense of ownership sila, if they know what they need to protect, mas magiging effective po yung kumbaga management strategies nila in the community level. And may mga sites din po tayo na gumagawa tayo ng mga mascots, ng flagship species ng mga LGUs, like sa isang LGU po madami po doong mga rabbit fish, so pag nakikita po ito ng mga bata, nasasabi nila na, ay, kailangan palang dumami yan kasi yan yung nagbibigay ng kabuhayan kay nanay at tatay. Parang importante po siya, mahalin po natin yung mga isda pong ganito. So yung ganun po na like ensuring na yung community po ay may ownership sa resources nila and instilling pride po for them na maging protective sa mga resources. Yun po yung parang basic po na menu natin or basic na ginagawa po sa mga LGUs. And of course, other than that, napakadami pa po like sa mga LGUs po natin na nasa protected area, kasama po natin yung mga communities at gumagawa po tayo together ng mga jingles or ng kanta tungkol po sa yaman po ng dagat po sa area nila like sa Canyon Strait at kinakanta po yun pati nga po sa mga disco sa fiesta ay piniplay po yun. So can you can only imagine po yung mga kasama po natin sa community na in times of celebration, they would always be reminded of what they have at saka why it's worth protecting and for future generations.
Are there other climate stories that you think are still being overlooked or underreported?
Siguro, i-add ko na lang din yung regarding sa tanong mo rin ka to, paano pa natin nasasama yung community kasi really the heart of our work is to ensure na community-based yung management. So, for example, ini-encourage natin yung ating mga mangingisda to fish at the right place, at the right time, and get the right sizes. So, yung mga managed access reserves nila or yung marine protected areas, syempre kasama sa kinukonsulta natin at gumagawa ng mga maps mismo to designate kung ano yung mga areas na worth protecting ay yung mga yung communities din mismo. Kasi, again, sila yung may nakakaalam kung ano yung dapat protektahan. At the same time, if they will be the one who will decide na ito yung poprotektahan namin, parang may stake din sila doon. So, may sense of responsibility and ownership din. Kasi kasama sila sa paggawa ng mga plano kung paano nga protektahan ng natural resources sa kanilang LGUs.
It's really nurturing that pride and sense of place, even in terms of like recognizing what natural resources they have, the closer they are to it, the more that they will want to nurture it.
Very true. And di ba parang alam natin na they grew up, diyan sila pinanganak, diyan sila nagtatrabaho. Pero pag nakita mo na minamapa nila kung ano yung resources na like, hala, ganito pala kadami yung mangroves namin. Pero taghan kami nito ng bagyo. Ah, dito pala yung coral reefs namin. Makikita rin natin mismo sa kanila kung gaano sila ka-proud na, oo nga pala, may ganito nga pala tayo. At nakakatulong to for our livelihood and for our food security.
Thank you. I think you've highlighted that there are some of the things that are being overlooked or underreported include all of these stories of resilience and adaptation of small island communities. And when we talk about stories of resilience and adaptation, what works for one community may be different from another. So maraming examples. Doc Lau, do you have additional inputs in terms of what you think are overlooked or underreported when it comes to stories related to island and coastal communities?
Actually, after Odette, I have been trying to advocate for bringing to the surface yung local ecological knowledge. We were really disappointed kasi nung Odette, UN OCHA was supposed to have an anticipatory action program, but it wasn't activated because it was purely forecast-based, and their forecast, like every other forecast agency, were not able to capture rapid intensification. So they had the program, it wasn't triggered because we relied on models to tell us when to act. I think that's very problematic. Our forecast capabilities are still emerging, especially yun sa rapid intensification. So instead, yung pinopropose ko ay why don't we include local ecological knowledge sa decision making? Kasi for example, in small islands, they have an entire vocabulary to describe winds and waves. And I was just thinking, what if we document that? What if we know how to utilize that? And in short, we have the local, kumbaga, real-time local information to supplement whatever we are seeing in our models. So they have terms, for example, kanaway, it's some wind. Pag is from that direction nanggagaling yung wind, it means that a weather system is coming. Balugo likely means storm surge kasi balugo is they used to describe strong winds na may kasamang malakas na alon. They also have the term walo-walo, which is a calm. So bumagyo, then nagkaroon ng calm, and then babalik yung hangin much stronger than before. So walo-walo is probably their term for yung lull pag nandyan na yung eye wall. The eye of the typhoon. So they have all of this information, but it's not being documented. And I wish I had the skills, the social scientist skills to document all of that. And I think there's a lot of storytelling that goes into that as well. So that's something that I'm excited to see. Yeah.
Thank you. That reminds me of stories of Yolanda, where people were told that it's a storm surge, but it's not a term that they're used to. Boyet, are you there?
Yes po. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Welcome back.
Yeah, I was narinig ko naman po yung ibang parts. So, yeah, I guess dagdagan ko lang din po yun, yung sa underreported, not documented. Bukod dun sa natural resources, I think tama rin po yung sinabi kanina about dun sa how they manage it. Hindi siya masyadong nado-document. And I think yun din yung isang reason related dun sa isang tanong kanina kung bakit masyado tayong focus sa infra hindi sa mga software measures na ecosystem-based. Kasi very limited lang din po yung knowledge natin kahit ng LGU pagdating sa ecosystem-based na projects. Pag sinabing ecosystem-based, ang very common, mangrove planting, tree planting. Compared sa seawall, pagpapatayo ng evacuation center, di ba? Kasi very limited wala tayong masyadong documentation ng mga ecosystem-based practices ng komunidad. At kung ito yung na-record natin, ngayon pa lang alam na natin, yun na yung pwedeng mas i-improve, no? Na itong mga existing na mga practices na to. Halimbawa po dun sa study na ginagawa ko nga, I try to focus dun sa document the eco-DRR practices ng small island. So include dito lahat ng mga DRR measures nila sa community na related sa kanilang environment. So isang halimbawa dito yung Yolanda daw, ilang pamilya dito sa Suluan ay nag-evacuate dun sa nearby caves. No? So naging siyang evacuation site. So yung ganito, kung iisipin natin sa by definition, yung cave ay natural resource. Yung practice nila ay ecosystem-based at nagamit siya for DRR. No? So kung gusto nating i-improve pa yon, siguro one measure for the LGU ay siguro i-map lahat ng mga gawan ng assessment yung mga caves na ito kung pwede nga ba siyang gamitin, mas matinding pag-aaral or i-improve nila, no? Stick to kung ano yung practice na original na ginagawa ng komunidad at dagdagan na lang siguro ng pailaw halimbawa or kung ano man, no? Kung by definition ito na isang nature-based solution, no, ng komunidad na pwedeng gamitin. So I think yun yung kailangan talaga i-document yung mga ganitong practices, mga ganitong stories from the island kasi dito nga talaga pwede mag-base ang ating mga LGU para dun sa kanilang mga measures na pwede nilang tawagin in a sense na nature-based solutions.
I have to agree with that. And that actually connects to what Doc Lau was saying na understanding the terminologies. Yun nga, they don't necessarily associate what's happening to them with climate change or the scientific terminologies, but they have like not a lot of the fisher folk would have tide apps to know kung kailan low tide or high tide. Alam nila by practice kung kailan dapat pumalaot at kailan hindi. Alam nila from the movement of the fishes kung kailan dapat mangisda or hindi. Boyet, balikan kita ulit muna bago tayo magpunta sa moving forward talaga and what we can do. It's been nearly a year since your campaign. How was your campaign received by the public and the community that you worked with?
Yeah, we were actually quite surprised sa accept. Kasi when we did, kasi on the final day of our campaign, we did like a stakeholder presence. Yung aming partner, aming kaibigan from the community, so she had the chance to speak or tell the story or validate kung ano yung mga nangyari, kung ano yung mga nilalaman ng aming mga videos. And meron kaming, hindi namin alam kung paano, pero biglang merong participant na from another small isle sa Cebu. And then nakaano pa siya, nasa bangka pa siya nung nag-video siya. So again, and sabi niya nakaka-relate talaga siya. Living in a small island nakalimutan ko kung island sa Cebu. Pero yung ganun, no? So in a way, parang realization din sa amin though magkakalayo yung mga small islands natin sa Pilipinas. Pero since may ganitong klase technology, ganyan, nakakapag-connect din. At doon namin nakita yung kahalagahan ng storytelling talaga. Pagdating sa climate change effects, stories from the islands. And yun, natuwa kami sa reception and we were able to show din yung aming video sa isang school sa Catanduanes. So again, coastal community rin. So mabuti naman tinanggap ang videos natin. And yun, patuloy pa rin kami, hopefully, i-spread lang. We plan to share it pa with other, kasi ang target namin sana ay sa schools and sa iba pang mga institutions. Halimbawa, kung papalabas sa TV, isa rin ng isang goal. Pero so far, yun pa lang po aming plans for
Salamat, Boyet. Actually, I remember nung multi-stakeholder forum, there were educators who were interested already in showing your videos to their students. But Follow up lang, Boyet. How is the Suluan community doing now, a year after your campaign? What kind of support do you think they need to become more adaptive and resilient to climate change?
So before po dun sa question niya, dagdagan ko lang. Kanina lang may nag-email from FEU. So yun nga, ini-invite kami ni ma'am to present ulit yung sangapulo para sa kanilang students. So yun. Dun po sa Suluan, so ang huling balik ko po doon ay this month, nung piyesta nila. Mga June yata yun. Ang napansin talaga doon ay dahil small island, ang pinakamalaking problema nila ngayon ay waste. Waste problem talaga. So wala silang masyadong way to transport yung kanilang waste island papunta sa mainland dahil bukod sa malayo, magastos din. So kasi meron silang binabayaran na isang boatman lang, bayaran ng barangay to travel to deliver waste, pero minsan hindi na nakakapunta dahil nga rin lalo pag maalon, ganyan. So ang usual na practice doon ay binabaon, sinusunog, and so yun pa lang yung waste na sila yung nag-generate. Iba pa yung waste na dinadala ng waves papunta sa kanila. And marami rin yun kasi Pacific side. So chinek din namin nun, no? Yung mga waste, mga plastic bottles galing pang Taiwan. Iba yung so doon mo makikita na talagang ito rin kailangan pagtuunan ng pansin to sa small island communities. Yung waste talaga, waste generation and kung waste management, isa sa mga I think na kailangan pagtuunan ng pansin ngayon sa Suluan.
Salamat, Boyet. That reminds me, I spoke to some bantay dagat in Lagadlarin in Lobo, Batangas. At sabi nga nila, kahit na gaano sila kasipag maglinis ng mga mangrove forests nila, pag dumating ang bagyo, ang basura from other shores will always get to them. So yes, waste really is an issue, and considering we have a lot of island communities, it's something that we really should be taking a look at. Candeze, from your experience, what kind of support do island communities need to become more adaptive and resilient?
In that regard, I think kailangan siya na parang two-pronged, both in the local level, like directly through the LGUs or the regional level, at saka sa national level din in terms of implementing yung national policy. So siguro sa national level, may ginagawa rin tayo ngayon sa RARE na tinatawag nating parametric insurance with DFAR, with DFWD, and PILG. So parang what we are hoping is itong mga parang based kasi sa study natin sa RARE, marami palang nawawala na parang earnings or income loss sa mga mangingisda sa panahon na hindi siya nakakalaot dahil malakas yung ulan. So what we're hoping is magkaroon ng mechanism para makakuha ng insurance or makaklaim ng insurance yung mga mangingisda. For example, pag 2 araw silang hindi makalaot dahil malakas yung ulan. So these are some of the examples ng national policies na sa tingin natin makakatulong sa ating mga municipal fishers to increase their resilience sa mga natural hazards brought about by climate change. Sa LGUs naman, napakalaking bagay na alam din ng ating nai-implement ng maayos ng ating mga LGUs, yung DRR plan nila. At the same time, in place already yung mga support na binibigay. For example, pag nagkakaroon ng bagyo, may mga subsidies tayo specific to our fishers, like mga fuel subsidies. After that, mabilis yung bounce back, mabilis yung response ng LGUs natin in terms of giving yung mga nasira or mga naanod na gear at boats ng ating mga mangingisda. Maganda sana naka-in place na yon para makapagpatuloy yung ating mga fisher sa livelihood nila. So I think that is a good start, and these initiatives nagsisimula na siya kahit papano sa local at sa ating national government na napakalaking tulong for our small islands and our municipalities.
Thanks, Candeze. Doc Lau, dahil ikaw ang nagbanggit ng development aggression, So, dahil na pag-uusapan dito, parang what's surfacing is there needs to be a balance between respecting local knowledge and the priorities of local governments. Unfortunately, we see more and more, pag nasa coast ka, ang naiisip na development ay opening it up as a tourism spot. Do you see tourism playing a role in sustainable futures for our coastal communities?
In a sense that it might reduce overfishing and encourage communities to preserve their reefs kasi yun yung pinupuntahan ng tourists, then I think that yes, it can be a vehicle. Kasi it's a resource and there are competing uses for it. So sa ngayon, in the Nakhon Bank, for example, the main livelihood source is fishing, which is okay naman, but unfortunately, meron talagang overfishing, especially na dumadami na yung population ng fishing communities. I think I showed you a photo of the island na talagang wala ng space to build a new house. So overfishing, illegal fishing, plastic pollution, all of that gives pressure on the environment. So sa tourism naman, since especially kung eco-tourism or eco-cultural tourism, then it means that what you're trying to show off is your ecosystem and your culture. So there is a strong push to conserve. But yun, meron ding mga pitfalls sa tourism, especially if we just welcome as many tourists as we can without considering ano yung carrying capacity nung ecosystem mo. So it's also a balancing act. Pero hindi na dapat bago sa atin yung balancing act na yon kasi yes, there's development aggression, but for the past since 2015 meron na tayong sustainable development goals and there are 17 of them. And we have been encouraged to not cherry pick a single goal, but instead try to accomplish as many goals as possible. So as long as we stay true to that and consider yung bottom line ng sustainability, which is people, planet, and profit, then I think that eventually we'll find that balance, hopefully, and have a better normal.
Thank you. Yes, Candeze.
Yung regarding din sa sabi ni Doc Lau with regards to competing resource use kasi yung ating mga small island communities, nararamdaman ito nating mga municipal fishers na meron ding threat. For example, mga commercial fishers natin, yung malalaking bangka talaga na pumapasok sa municipal waters using big boats and highly efficient gear na nadi-display talaga yung ating mga mangingisdang nakasakay sa maliliit na demotor at naka-hook and line na pangingisda. And that's also another factor na kailangan din i-consider in terms of in pursuing like economic development, na sino ba yung kailangan nating i-prioritize at sino yung mauna. Similar din sa, for example, mga developments like infrastructure. And really, at the end of the day talaga, parang in raising equity, mas kailangan nating tulungan at i-empower yung mas nangangailangan, which are our coastal communities. And at the same time, sila nga talaga yung yung frontliner natin for food security na nakita talaga natin during the pandemic.
Thank you, Candeze. So in our discussion, we're able to surface risks and impacts faced by coastal and island communities. And habang maraming stories of resilience, I go back to yung unang nabanggit ni Doc Lau. There's a threshold to their adaptive capacity and resilience, which can be exacerbated or can no longer work once we experience higher and higher warming. Bukod sa napag-usapan natin na difficulties ng coastal communities and knowing that we're already on track for higher warming, what are the possible actions you think that can be undertaken as we move forward so that we can help these communities?
I think ito based lang din sa yung importance ng alliance. Ito po ito sa discussion ba ng multi-stakeholder. So, even yung ganito yung story, sa dami ng small island communities meron tayo, dito sa Pilipinas pa lang. Hindi natin maka-establish na meron ng islands na net dito sa atin. Meron mga initiative noon. May asa ako na after ng Yulan, gusto nilang mag-develop nga ng parang ganong klase ng network na small island communities. Pero nung binalikan ko yung article, tapos research ko ulit, parang hindi na siya natuloy. Ang purpose kung bakit nila gustong gawin sana yon ay dahil nga pagdating sa nung Yolanda at sa anumang na hydromet na affected talaga ang small at iba yung kanilang needs, iba yung kanilang so na isang yung pagkakaroon para dihan at sa pag-document niya ng mga traktong kasi ng alliance. Kung nagagawa siya ng sa globally, meron yung small developing states, hindi kayang gawin dito sa Pilipinas na kahit small island municipalities or provinces or barangays na kung magkaroon ng ganong, I think mas makakatulong yun sa research na kailangan na gawin sa mga projects at syempre sa pagpa-planning, mas malawakan na pagpa-planning dating sa climate action at saka sa DRR.
Ang ganda ng mga aral ng recommendations na na-mention ni Boyet. And siguro to add to that, parang paano natin mas ano yung other solutions moving forward. We can continue or mas dagdagan pa yung, for example, yung pag-build ng community engagement and effective management body sa LGU level para makasupport sa local decision making and ensure na makaparticipate yung ating mga coastal community sa decision making. And also, dapat makakatulong na ma-enable natin yung ating mga coastal communities, yung ating mga mangingisda to adopt to more sustainable and better regulated fishing behaviors and napakalaking bagay din yung using data for decision making. So in helping yung pag-collect, pag-disseminate at pagtulong sa fishing communities para magamit yung data for decision making. And another also is i-advance natin yung inclusion ng ating coastal fishing community sa financial and market opportunities para ma-increase yung household resilience nila. And at the national level, napakalaking bagay na patuloy yung pag-enact ng policies to promote and sustain yung community-based management approach for fisheries management.
Thanks, Candice. Doc Lau, do you want to add to that?
Yes, so actually in my understanding, both si Boyet and Candice are saying na we should focus on the people and building partnerships and empowering people to build their adaptive capacity, and I completely agree. So actually for me, very blurry ang line between adaptive capacity and development, and I would even go as far as saying that development is adaptation. So seeing that, yes, we care about the environment. Yes, we need to conserve the environment, but that needs to happen within the broader development goals din. Kasi we can talk about conserving coral reefs, but what about the livelihood of the fishermen? And as long as we are conscious of that, na meron silang ding development issues today, they cannot afford to think of the typhoon in December, this coming December sa 1-year anniversary, because they have to think about where to get their food today, how to send their children to school. So just be conscious, I guess, na yes, the climate problem is a big problem, but they also have development problems that they need to face today. And I really feel na addressing climate change will have to be through development din.
Thanks, Doc Lau. O nga naman, no, parang mag-conserve tayo, pero if the people in the community continue living in subsistence mechanism, parang hindi rin yun maganda. Last question na lang, although you've touched on this in different ways in our previous questions. Doc Lau, you're in Bohol. Boyet, you're in Marinduque. Candeze, you mentioned you're from Leyte. What is the climate dream that you have for our coastal and small island communities? Kumbaga, yung mga companies are aiming for net zero by 2030, 2040. Kayo, ano yung, kung may aim for the coastal and small island communities, ano yun?
For me, well, kailangan talaga ng transformational change. So incremental change is no longer enough to deal with the climate problem. But for me, the way I see it, yung transformation doesn't have to be into something, into the unknown. For me, it's more of rediscovering our intimate relationship with the environment. So nakikita ko, yung climate dream ko is ayun, that we live a simpler and more balanced life. Yung tipong paglabas mo ng bahay, nakikita mo yung mga puno, pagpunta mo sa dagat, marami ng isda ulit. I feel like a simpler life in a richer environment is the dream for me.
Parang ano, no, ang dami kong biglang naisip na pangarap para sa coastal communities natin with that question, Tato, no? Pero siguro yung ultimate dream ko for our small islands and our coastal communities is magkaroon sila ng enough na kita na pang-araw-araw na yung mabubusog sila, may breakfast, lunch at dinner sila. Tapos sa panahon ng bagyo, andito na yung climate change. Naiintindihan nila kung ano yung epekto nun sa kanila at alam nila kung ano yung dapat nilang gawin in respond to that at makakabangon sila agad-agad. At siguro pangatlo, yung coastal communities natin, yung mga pamilyang nangangarap na mapagtapos nila ng college, yung mga anak nila ay makapagtapos ng pag-aaral. Yun yung parang sigurong tatlong pinaka-top 10 pangarap ko para sa coastal communities natin.
Thank you, Candeze. And yes, Boyet.
Hirap. Parang ganun din eh. Pero siguro pinaka-ultimate dream talaga. Given yung talagang projections nga, 2100, year 2100, kasi lulubog ang mga isla. So ang pinaka-dream talaga ay manatili silang small island. Happy island. At sustainable. They can send their kids to quality. So na-highlight din sa video, small problems, kahit para sa kanila small problems, pero in a way, ito na yung epekto ng nature. Access to education, access to basic services, ay epekto ng climate change. Yung fishing spot nila hindi lumalayo sa kanilang lugar, no, dahil sa pag-init ng dagat. So, but I guess yun yung ultimate dream is for these islands to remain and hindi mabawasan ang 7,800 plus na isla dito sa atin.
Salamat, Boyet. Ang rich ng ating discussion. I've been working in the climate change space and I'm aware of how it impacts the coasts, but ang dami kong bagong learnings from the three of you. Unang-una is yung nabanggit ni Doc Lau na dapat sanay na tayo sa balancing act, na we should be able to balance conservation and adaptation with sustainable development and a living wage for people in communities. Pangalawa, na maraming stories of resilience from small island communities. Uso man ngayon ang EBA and nature-based solutions in the international discussion. but our small island communities have long histories of coping by practicing already traditional nature-based solutions. But the only way we can surface those and scale those up is to actually document them. So kasama din sa documentation is being able to allowing small island communities to participate and be included in government policies and strategies. Given that we are an archipelagic nation, the strategies that focus on island and coastal communities are not in the forefront of our development. Lalo na nabanggit ninyo yung waste management. Paano nga ba? Sa dami ng isla natin, how should we be managing our wastes? And lastly, what happens to the coasts don't stay in the coasts. Food security, malaking component niyan ay ang fisheries. And yet when we talk about loss and damage in the national setting, it's still mostly focused on agriculture. Marami pa tayong pwedeng himayin dito and napakaganda ng discussion. And I hope we can continue that discussion in other formats and activities. But for now, we would like to thank our esteemed guests for the Kwentong Isla episode, Dr. Laurice Jamero of the Manila Observatory, Torres of Salikhain Kolektib, and Candeze Mongaya of Rare Philippines. We will not be able to bridge climate knowledge to action on the ground without the support, experience, and insights of experts, storytellers, and advocates. We hope you will join Asia Society Philippines and the Oscar M. Lopez Center in our other episodes of ang ating Kwentong Klima toward raising awareness on climate change and enabling climate action for Filipino communities. Let's collaborate, let's communicate, and let's build climate resilient communities. But for now, bye everyone.